not having anybody to talk to and deal with these issues that are popping up as a leader is a recipe for disaster, hidden sin, and ultimately moral failure. Right. And that's
Right.
where the entire
Right.
ministry falls apart on the other side of that.
Wow. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Stress Test. We've got a great guest today. We love authenticity and stories on this show. And Justin Franich has an amazing story. In 2005, he himself entered into Teen Challenge as an addict. He overcame crystal meth, came to faith. His life was turned around, and now, and for 13 years, he was, by the way, founded and directed a teen challenge in the Shenandoah Valley. He pastors a church there now, if that wasn't enough, called Brookside Church, and as a part of his mission, he has a great podcast. Just an incredible story.
He and his wife, Ashley, have 4 daughters, 2 adopted. They're in the process of adopting the last one. They foster and adopt. They are committed to the struggle of that ministry, as well as, just managing their kids, homeschooling their daughters, and, as Shane said, pastoring and running his own ministry. So his own business. So you're going to love hearing what Justin has to say. We can't wait.
Yeah, can't wait. And you're going to love especially the way he walks with people. So, Kate, come with us on the journey. Well, welcome, Justin. Thank you so much for being on our show. I want you to say your last name to make sure I've been saying it correctly.
It's Franich.
Franich, yes.
Yeah, that's it. Nice. Yeah, you've
that's
got
like
it.
Schlesman.
Yeah, you have the same problem we have. It's Shane Schlesman. Just go with Shane.
Yeah.
Nobody says it right.
People usually completely miss the I. They just say French or Frenchy.
Yeah.
And I don't know how the I gets after the H. But
Frenchy, that sounds like a nickname.
Yeah, we get
right.
Schlesselman and Schellesman and
Nice.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, Justin, I always love having, from the moment I met you, we met through a mutual friend, and he is amazing as well, Chuck Balsamo. And he introduced us and we hit it off. And one of the things I loved about you was just your transparency. Can't wait to learn more about your story today, for sure. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, certainly excited to be here. Enjoy what you guys are doing with Stress Test and just helping leaders, and serving pastors, serving those who serve others. It's such an important work that you guys are doing, and on just getting that out there and trying to raise these awareness levels so we're not all stressed out and burnt out and tired and frustrated, when we don't need to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Justin, can you tell us a little bit about your family and your background, and maybe even why this topic is pertinent to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was 3, no, I'm just kidding. I won't go that far back.
You were a stressed out toddler.
You start whenever you want to start.
Right. No, so I am a local pastor. I also I'm married. I've got 4 daughters from ages 14 all the way down to 1.5. And so we've got the range of girls running around our house. We're homeschool parents. We also we do foster ministry on actually our youngest. We're in the process of adopting.
Wow.
Did you lose me? No, I'm still there. Yeah. And so man, the reason I'm here connecting with you, I serve as a local church pastor, but prior to that, years ago, I was a crystal meth addict back during my teenage years from 15 to 20. And after breaking free from that through a program called Teen Challenge, the Lord got a hold of my life. My dad and I started a local teen challenge here in the Shenandoah Valley, and my wife and I served there as rehab directors for 13 years as executive directors, and just loving on people, trying to help those struggling with addiction. And that journey was a learning curve. We learned a lot during the process, lots of joy, but also lots of sorrow. You talk about leadership stress. I think one of those seasons, during those seasons of working at Teen Challenge, I've talked about this a lot recently because I've been away from that ministry now for 3 years doing other things. But recently I've been chatting about how some of the struggles of walking through that ministry, having family week and graduations, celebrating with students, watching them, get free and moving forward with their life, but then going home and picking up the phone and hearing a mom call and say that they want to remove the application from the program because they just recently lost their kid to an overdose, and living in the middle of those emotions. We lived in the middle of that for 13 years. And then we decided to step away from rehab ministry for a little bit and go into the less stressful world of pastoring a church. And so we took on Brookside Church in 2020, right during the pandemic. And I currently serve there as a bivocational lead pastor while I'm running my own podcast on the side. I do some media and editing work for folks, and it's awesome. My wife is such an amazing woman. She is, she homeschools all of our girls. She's a graduate of Christ for the Nations out in Dallas, Texas. Just Jesus lover, so passionate, and just so good with our kids. And that's us in a nutshell. So.
That's amazing.
That's inspiring. Yeah.
Justin, your story is really miraculous. How you went from addict yourself to helping addicts to pastoring a church and making disciples in other ways. Tell us a little bit more about that journey. You said that so quickly, and I don't want to make you talk about anything you don't want to talk about. But I just think the journey from crystal meth addict to pastor is worthy of pausing and exploring a little bit. Would you let us do that?
Sure, 100%. Yeah.
We'd love to go just hear some of that story.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in church, and my mom and dad, we were always the first ones in, last ones out of the church growing up. And at 14, 15, I started hunting down my identity, trying to figure out who I was. And these stories, it's a lot of the same, just trying to find out who I was and not really sure about my identity. And so I turned to drugs, and that world accepts you. And that's one of the things I think people realize. It's like, well, most people that are struggling with addiction aren't struggling with addiction because they want to become long-term addicts. There's either an escape, an identity issue that they're dealing with, and that's what I was looking for. I was looking for acceptance, and the drugs did that. And so I did that for about 5 years of my life. The crystal meth addiction became full blown. I was an intravenous user, and so finally I lost everything. I had destroyed all my family relationships, and my mom, my dad, my grandmother, my uncle, they did an intervention one day in my grandparents' house. I showed up, all these family members were there, and we didn't really know what an intervention was at the time. They just knew that they weren't going to enable my poor decisions anymore. And they said, either you get help, go to Teen Challenge, or we can't do this anymore. And I just remember feeling hopeless and lost. I went into the backyard of my grandparents' house that night I had an 8 ball of crystal meth. It was 3.5 grams of meth in my shoe, feeling depressed and lost. And I said, man, Lord, if you don't do something, I'm going to pull all these drugs out of my shoe and inject them at once and end my life, because I just couldn't see a way out. And I had an encounter with the Lord in the yard that night. I broke down in tears, weeping and crying, and just saying, Lord, what's become of my life that my own grandmother wants nothing to do with me anymore? And that's when I went to Teen Challenge, and the Lord got a hold of my life there in Long Island, New York at Teen Challenge. And I just remember hearing the call to God to ministry. It's that whole idea of, when you've been rescued from a burning building, you want to rescue as many other people as you can. And that became the theme of my life, just trying to tell as many people as I can about the joy that I found in Jesus. Going from this place of, despair and desperation to destiny, if you will, knowing that God had redeemed my life and created me for a purpose. And that's been my recurring theme. When I showed up at Long Island, New York, the staff member there, and I tell this story over and over, and you have to excuse me, still messes me up now. It's been 17 years. Dude looks at me when I walks in the door. He doesn't see the bruise marks on my arm. He looks at me and he says, Justin, God has a plan for your life. And I've been foolish enough to believe that ever since. And that's just been the theme. I mean, if there was
Yeah.
any mantra or statement for my life, it would be
Right.
just knowing that God has had a plan all along.
Right.
And so every decision, every step of faith, whether that's starting a rehab ministry, starting a podcast, going after the church, it's just knowing that way back then, God had a plan. Man, if
Mm-hmm.
he can do the impossible, pull me out of meth addiction, then
Mm-hmm.
what is there that he can't do?
Wow. We
Mm-hmm.
see in ministry, you see so many massive turnarounds, and none bigger than this story. Probably this story just kind of epitomizes why we do what we do, right? To see people turn around. But there's a big difference between turning around and then becoming the person who can walk with others who need to turn around. You made that jump. Tell us about how in the world did you cover that bridge
Yeah.
from going from where you were to your destiny and embracing that? Because I think there's a lot of folks that might be listening who are like, yeah, that's amazing. How in the world could I help someone else?
Yeah. I think for me, it just was starting with what I had. I think a lot of times I watched my wife for 13 years work in residential recovery ministry and start a women's home and do all that stuff. And she had never picked a drug up in her life. I married the Bible school graduate. She didn't know my past life. And I think it's just understanding that God has just called us to love on people, and I think sometimes, especially in ministry, we can overcomplicate that. And for me, that was it really was just as simple as telling people about the hope that I found in Christ. Now, of course, as I matured in the faith, I started to do some distance education to learn, and dig into the theology and learn how to study my Bible and deliver sermons and all that jazz.
Sure.
But at root, it was just like, man, we saw a need in our community. There was no residential recovery programs. So we rented a house, had no clue what we were doing, and just decided to take people in. And it people started to show up. And so we followed best practices from other ministries, and we learned as we went. And I think that's the part. I mean, you've got to be okay with failing from time to time. We've got to be okay doing things a little messy while we get to the end result. So many of us tend to be perfectionists. I think we want to get it perfect from day one, and that's not life, and that's not discipleship, because discipleship is incredibly messy, and it's as leaders learning to be okay with that.
Wow.
That is really good. We were just having the same conversation.
We were literally yesterday.
About the whole house and helping people who are really struggling in life. What struck me when you were just talking about making the choice to help someone else, really you're helping somebody from your own pain. And I think that's a fearful or a shameful thing for a lot of people. Like they've had a transformation, they've had a past, they've made that turn, and they would like other people to avoid the same problem. But yet you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position to tell your own story and to live in that space.
Yeah.
Maybe because there's temptation, maybe because it brings up a lot of heartache or guilt or shame or whatever. What would you say? And pastors are really no different. I mean, people are people, right? We all have stuff. So what would be your advice or your personal experience, perhaps, to having the courage to overcome all the voices in your head that are saying, you can't do this, you're not qualified to do this, you shouldn't tell that story, what will people think of you? That whole negative spiral that keeps our shame stories inside, which then keeps us from helping people in the areas that we actually know about firsthand.
Yeah, that's good. And I definitely rub against that a lot. I think sometimes we're worried about being exposed. We don't want people to know about the struggle. And I think over the course of my lifetime, it's just, if I keep it in the light, I can never be exposed over it. And that's been the decision, is just, there's no shame around my addiction anymore, because it's out there. Everybody in the world knows about it. I talk about it online. I shared this on one of my podcasts a few weeks ago. You can go to my Facebook profile and find my before and after pictures, and they're going to be there forever. And so that's out there in the open. And especially in our churches right now, for pastors and leaders who have struggled with addiction in the past, there are so many people battling addiction right now.
Yeah.
And if you have even a part of a story where I went down this road for a little bit, or I was dabbling with it and can connect with people in that place of vulnerability, it lets people know they're not struggling alone. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for those who are dealing with addiction. Like we tend to show up at church and we think that everybody's judging us, everybody dislikes us. That's not the case at all. But that's the negative self-talk that the addict's thinking coming into it. And so when they hear anybody in leadership say, hey, no, you're not alone, I did that too, there's that connection point. And then those walls begin to come down. And we get that ability then to step in and minister to them. So our stories carry a tremendous amount of power. And it doesn't have to be addiction, whatever that weakness or struggle is. If we can get beyond that place of shame and share, we can really impact a lot of other people.
Which all shame is addiction, technically, right? So, I mean, everybody's an addict for something. Everybody, when they have a stress point, goes to that numbing place.
You just want to mask
whether, I mean, it doesn't have to be drugs. It could be, Netflix, or
you just want to anesthetize the pain and
or being a workaholic, or alcohol, or it could be anything. And I think all of us have coping mechanisms, many of which are unhealthy.
Do you agree with that, Justin? Or does that sound like you guys have no idea what you're talking about because addicts are completely different? Or is there a similarity between how we numb ourselves at home every night to that addict who's maybe trapped in a much harder drug?
Yeah, I think Rick Warren did a good job talking about that when he rolled out the whole Celebrate Recovery stuff, and pushing it as a ministry for hurts, habits, and hangups, right? Rather than it's just substance abuse. That we all have a tendency to have hurts and develop habits, and then have to address some of our hangups. And so those are the things I think we have to really guard against in leadership. As we start to experience stress, we find ways to escape from the stress rather than heading to the healthy things, whether that be diet, exercise, to get into our word, pray, all the things that we know to do. We tend to want the thing that gives us that dopamine hit, right? And that doesn't have to be drugs. That is turning the TV on, mindlessly scrolling social media. All these things they give that same chemical. I chatted with a health coach the other day, and he was saying sugar is that same way. Sugar is like cocaine in the brain, right? I mean, it has the same impact. And so we're developing addictions if we're not paying attention, right? And we start to dig into that.
And I love what you said at the beginning, doesn't it all go back to the why? Like, we tend to put on healthy habits without digging into, why do I need to go to this place anyway? And you said when you became an addict that you were looking for acceptance and identity, and you found that in addiction because everybody's accepting everybody because you're all, you're self-harming, but we do that in other avenues too, right? If we could go back to the source of why I choose to spend my time in this way, or why I choose these type of people to be with, or why I do the negative self-talk, is that maybe all pointing to the same identity and acceptance crisis that we have?
Absolutely. And I think as leaders, we have to be careful of that too, because sometimes if our rhythms are wrong as leaders, then, and we don't have a healthy balance in our churches and in our ministries and whatever God's got us serving in, and we're miserable, then rather than addressing the habits and the rhythms, we can turn to things to try to mask that misery. And I think those type of things, that stuff starts to grow in the dark, that leads to a lot of the large, huge moral failures that we've seen, right? You've got people that are out of rhythm. They're frustrated with their current situation in life, And so they start to turn to some of these behaviors and patterns, and they keep them in the dark. They don't have anybody they can talk to. They don't have any leaders they can trust. There isn't this ability to just be vulnerable. And not everybody's called to be completely vulnerable from a stage. I get that. And I don't suggest that for everybody. That's just something God's called me to do. But not having anybody to talk to and deal with these issues that are popping up as a leader is a recipe for disaster, hidden sin, and ultimately moral failure. Right. And that's where the entire ministry falls apart on the other side of that.
Wow. Speaking of ministry, you not only had a ministry to helping rehab and that whole process, and with your own story, but you decided, like you said, to take on a way less stressful job. And you took on pastoring at the most stressful possible time to take a church. You took a church and became its pastor. And they couldn't afford the budget to pay a pastor full time. So you had to go bivocational. You started your own business. So you run a business, you're in helping in rehab, and now you're pastoring a church. How in the, like, I can't even manage pastoring a church. How do you manage all three of those things at the same time?
Yeah, sometimes we don't. I think that's
good answer.
Yeah, no, we've walked through some things the last couple of years with that, just trying to learn. I mean, it's the church has been phenomenal, and rather than we live an hour away from the church, we took it on. I stepped in to guest speak and never left, and so here we are 3 years later, and so the bivocational was known going into it, and we've enjoyed doing that. But about a year and a half ago, there was an opportunity to take a little bit of a bump in personal salary, but not quite get to the point where I didn't have to work part-time. And so I chose to bring on an associate rather than taking more money for myself to spread some of the load out. And so I have an associate that serves with me. We both serve bivocational. And so the church gets the benefit of two part-time guys, basically a full-time guy, right? Without having to have the resources to necessarily hire somebody full-time. So that's been a huge help. My associate lives in the community. He's closer, he's connected. And so that's really helped us kind of rethink on what is the first milestone, right? Because for a small church, the goal is we want to get our senior pastor on full-time. That's the first major goal for a lot of places.
Yeah.
And we decided to kind of go a little differently. Let's bring a couple part-time guys on, have folks working bivocationally, and try to build a stronger, healthier church that doesn't have to fork out all the cash for a full-time salary, that we can grow the church first and then take care of us later. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask you so much about that, because I'm curious, how did bringing on someone shouldering that burden with you make a difference in your stress and how you manage it? Did it make a difference? And going back, would you say to others, hey, it's way more important for you to have a partner than it is for you to have personal gain?
Yeah, 100%. So last February, we started to foster a young baby. She was brand newborn, born prematurely 2 months in the NICU. And our entire world changed overnight. My wife started to just have to be gone 10, 15 hours a week over at UVA, tending for this baby. And then, of course, I told you earlier, we homeschool. So my entire world shifted because I'm home with the rest of my girls while all this is taking place. And our next year, we thought that, okay, this is just going to be a few months in the hospital. And after that, our rhythm will get back to normal. And the next year was challenging. Lots of appointments, lots of trips over the mountain. Our entire world and dynamic changed. And I said all that to say, having that associate pastor, having that other person in the community, while I couldn't be as present, made a world of difference of holding the church together. And so it definitely was a big win in that regards.
I was going to ask you, which you have somewhat already answered, which I think is fantastic. But when everybody has to just make decisions about time and priority, right? What's going to prioritize over something else. In church world, everything at church always feels like a priority because people are demanding or expecting whatever. And I was going to ask you, how do you prioritize or manage your schedule? Because you have multiple vocations, and being a parent is also a vocation, right? It's family time is critical.
Yeah, what a huge calling.
And so how do you decide what takes precedent over something else? Because we can have it organized in our heads, right? But then a crisis happens and everything adjusts. And that's kind of more the norm than the exception. So how do you make those choices?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes, some weeks it's difficult. I mean, and for Ashley and I, we have set some non-negotiables in our personal lives,
Mm,
and so our family is we will always homeschool. That's something we're going to do until our children are 18. She is home full time. That's another thing that we have decided, that she is going to
mhm,
be home, homeschooling the kids, working in the house, doing that. That's just something for us. And our home will always be open to foster and adopt.
mm,
Those are three of our non-negotiables. And so those are at the top of the priority list. I'm
mhm,
not going to add too much in that's going to disrupt our ability to do those things. If
mm,
those things start to get challenged or we start to lose that, then I
mm,
know something's off in the rest of my schedule. And
mm,
then the rest of it is really just looking at time. I've got a business, I've got to pay the bills, I've got to make sure the family is fed, And then the same thing with the church. That is a part-time job right now. And
mhm.
so I think sometimes that makes people uncomfortable
Yeah,
because there's so much calling associated with pastoring. And it's like, well, you just got to give more time, Justin. And it's like,
yeah,
I would love to, but
yeah,
it's a part-time job right now. And
right.
that's a boundary that I have to set. And when the ministry grows, I'll be happy to give more time. But and I've heard all the statements, having conversations with people. You can't look at it a part-time job. You're just a hireling, et cetera, all that stuff. All these fancy churchy words that people throw out, and it's just like, look, this is the reality. And so, serving bivocationally is difficult, but it's possible.
Mm.
And, and if I can go one step further, I'm sorry, I don't want to dominate, but
No,
like
yeah.
on the
Please
other
do.
side of that, there's a huge benefit to bivocational pastoring. I mean, the church isn't stressed they're for finances. There's
Mhm,
not all of that stuff when the church is in a young and a growing place. All that stuff isn't on the church, right? To support a leader. And so, yes, my attention is divided, but one of the things we see is that the resources are spread out a little bit more. So we in the last 3 years, we've put a roof on the church. We've renovated the sanctuary, updated things, and the church is able to continue to move forward. We rent our church out to a local school during the week to help cover some of the more of the expenses. So we've got several things going on that are just a huge benefit because I am serving bivocational, and we're not stressing the church out in the process of trying to support me full time.
Does bivocational ministry help you keep the ministry simple? Like, instead of adding programs and people and, all the big stuff, does it keep you more focused on
being able to say no to
the
certain things.
gospel and simple discipleship? Like the Matthew
Yeah,
28, let's keep it the main thing.
100%. Yeah. And Pastor Chuck, boss Simon that connected us, says this all
Yeah.
the time to me: who, not how, right? That's
Yeah.
one of his
Mm,
statements. And I've
mhm.
I've definitely had to lean into that as a bivocational pastor, because I can't be there all the time. So who's going to do it, right? If there's a ministry idea, there's a plan to get something done. We want to start XYZ over here. Great. I will empower you. We will make it happen. But who's going to do it? And if that person isn't able to do it anymore, there's no sacred cows here. We will, we will chop, we will move
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
because I just don't have the time to take
yeah.
more things on,
Mm.
and so I think that's been very helpful.